Well, hey, everybody, welcome to the Dr. Jockers Functional Nutrition Podcast, where we know that your body was created to heal itself, and we're here to arm and equip you with the resources you need to be at your best. And I have got a great return guest. This is Dr. Jack Wolfson, cardiologist, a good friend of mine, and just a wealth of information. Really excited to have you on again, Jack. And we're going to talk a lot about COVID-19. We're going to talk about hydroxychloroquine, mitochondrial health, AFib. We're going to talk about vitamin D, how it impacts ACE2 receptors, and so much more. So, Jack, thanks for joining us here on the podcast.
No, David, pleasure to be on. As always, appreciate any time to be able to, see you discuss this. You have a great conversation about health and wellness, and people like you and I got to keep shouting the truth from the roof, listening to mainstream and certainly mainstream medical doctors. They're not getting the full picture by any means, and that we're here to provide.
Yeah, absolutely. And the last time Jack was on, we talked a lot about cholesterol. So if you're interested in that, check that out. That was actually episode 1. I think we're on like episode 50 now. So it was time to have Jack back because, obviously right here, at the time we're doing this interview, it's early August. And, we've got, I guess, the quote unquote second wave of COVID-19 and a lot of panic going on, a lot of people being affected by this. And so really wanted to dive into some of the details behind COVID-19 and what's happening. And so, Jack, what are you seeing from a medical perspective with COVID-19? Obviously, we're seeing, most of the people that are having bad effects have comorbidities. And so what are you seeing as being kind of the primary driver between, because we've adapted to viruses throughout the history of mankind. So why is this creating more panic than ever before?
Well, I think, the panic situation is undoubtedly media driven. I mean, that's for sure. Never before in our history has the media really taken a story and taken it, to this levels. Obviously, if we're talking about Ebola and Zika and, the original SARS and all these other, or even like a measles outbreak, again, there is propaganda and sensationalism around all of it. But to this level right now, there's never been anything like that. And if the vast majority of people, I'll talk about my practice in general. I mean, I've probably got 3,000 people in my practice, and I can assure you that, again, if they weren't watching television and heard all the propaganda, we'd never know anything about it, because my 3,000 people, I can really count on, on one hand. In fact, just a few people that have been that have had symptoms of a viral infection, and then later on would test positive for COVID antibodies, nasal swab. But I'm getting no calls into my practice about people that are in the hospital, people that have died from COVID, none of it. So again, out of these naturally minded people, and not everybody's perfect, of course, or anything close, but again, we're not really hearing a lot from them. And again, if it wasn't for the news media and internet, the main internet sources really pushing whatever, publicity, sensational agenda to be able to sell more advertising and get, people over to their website or to their television, again, we wouldn't even know it was a thing.
Yeah, I completely agree with you on that. And, some of the pushback I've gotten is whenever I talk about, hey, it's really people with comorbidities. It's, people that are end of life, right? So people in nursing homes, which obviously we want to protect everybody. Every life is precious, and we want to protect people. But the reality is people do die, right? People die every day, and 100,000 people die from, bacterial pneumonia every single year. So it's like we can totally try to quarantine people, but at the same time, immunocompromised people who are ready to die will find a way to die either way. I mean, this is 100,000 people die every year, bacterial pneumonia in the hospital every single year. And so we don't really hear about that. So, when it comes to this, one of the big pushbacks people will give me is they're like, yeah, but 100 and, whatever it is, 50,000, 160,000 people now have died. And so, just kind of talking about numbers, a lot of people just get worried just based on that. And again, you were talking about the media. What have you seen? Have you looked into like the testing that they're doing or anything like that? What are you seeing from your end?
Well, I know once again, it's just these numbers are really just pulled out of thin air, and I think this is even getting into mainstream as far as where do these numbers come from. Now, I worked in the hospitals for 16 years. I come up with medical diagnoses based on, and so to come up with a coding strategy of how you get reimbursed in the hospitals. So it's very clear that the more codes and diagnosis codes you put in to the computer system, the more the hospital gets reimbursed for insurance, the more you as a doctor can bill for a higher level of care. So if I see a person and they come in with a runny nose, well, I can't bill for a high level of care if they've just got the medical diagnosis of seasonal rhinitis or viral, infectious, rhinitis or, runny nose. Maybe that would pay, for example, $50. But if I put in there rhinitis, along with shortness of breath, along with abnormal EKG, the more that I start stacking up these things, and they may or may not be true. I mean, really, the person can just put in these diagnosis codes, and they don't even need to be true. And a lot of people have got in trouble and jailed for Medicare fraud in these particular scenarios. Well, in this thing, so if somebody comes into the hospital with shortness of breath and it's from congestive heart failure, like they're in congestive heart failure, as people, it happens obviously single day, hundreds, if not thousands of times across the United States. And then if you are to run a test on them, or maybe not even run a test, maybe you suspect COVID, well, then you can add that to the diagnosis. And now, again, you get a higher level of billing. You can give that person antibiotics. Maybe they didn't need the antibiotics at all. After all, I mean, COVID, is a virus, and now you give antibiotics, which is antibacterial, but you gave it again. It's all about the billing. So I think ultimately, though, David, as you know, is that every year the CDC estimates that 40 to 60 million Americans have the flu. About 40 to 60,000 of those are estimated to have died, from the flu on that year. And the web says these are all estimates. They're all estimates. So it's really hard to say, but let me wrap it up and say, listen, obviously it's a shame when healthy people die. That's for sure. I mean, a shame is an understatement. I mean, and all life is precious. That being said, the vast majority of these people do have comorbidities. And then I'll throw it back to you, David. What do you think when people say, to you, so-and-so got really sick, but they were healthy? But they were totally healthy, David. I mean, how does David Jockers determine what is a truly healthy person when someone says, oh, they were in perfect health?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what does define health? Because most people out there think if you are not diagnosed with any sort of chronic condition, that immediately means that you're healthy. But we're not looking at your underlying levels of insulin resistance. We're not looking at, your vitamin D levels. We're not looking at a lot of these different factors, your hemoglobin A1C. We know that blood sugar and insulin sensitivity play a huge role in your overall health. In fact, with COVID, we're seeing people that have comorbidities that are typically associated with metabolic disease, obesity, being overweight, high blood pressure, diabetes. These are the people that are struggling the most. And so before you get diabetes, though, you have an underlying level of insulin resistance. Not like you just all of a sudden wake up one day, you have diabetes. You're building that for 20, 30, 40 years. And so that person maybe 10 years into developing that, not really have any major symptoms. I mean, you typically don't feel diabetes until the later stages. You don't feel high blood pressure, until it gets really bad. And yet, so they're building this. They've never, been diagnosed. They haven't been diagnosed yet. They still are able to do all their daily activities, but they have this underlying level of suboptimal health. And then that's obviously, predisposes them to a worsening condition. In fact, I've seen my friend Mike Mutzel. I know you know him as well. He's posted on his Instagram several different people, like one guy who, had pictures where he looked really ripped, right? So he was strong, looked good on the outside, and he had a really serious bout with COVID. And he was drinking sodas in the hospital. And when he left the hospital, he stopped at McDonald's,
Mm.
right? So he had a really bad lifestyle. So you could look good on the outside, but still have metabolic disease on the inside. I mean, there's people all the time that you would never think, these are people that run, they're active, but they end up dropping dead of a heart attack or getting cancer or something like that. And so, it's more than just what you look like. And of course, activity we highly recommend, and that is a positive element of good health. But that alone doesn't indicate that you're healthy.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I totally agree. And I take the example of this actor on television. His name is Bob Harper, and Bob Harper was the I guess health expert on The Biggest Loser TV show. And then Bob Harper had a massive heart attack, and everyone's like, "Can you believe Bob Harper had a heart attack? He looks like he's like Iron Man. He looks like in incredible shape." And it's like, again, we know nothing about Bob Harper, and I know nothing about him in particular. But let me just say, like you said, I've was maybe inside filming all day long under the artificial lights. I don't know. I know Bob Harper worked out, but again, I don't know what his diet was like. Or was he eating McDonald's cookies and cupcakes, but then running on the treadmill? What was his stress level like? What were his sleep patterns like? What were his environmental toxins and exposure like? So yeah, it comes into so many different factors. And whenever someone says they're oh, so-and-so was healthy, I'm like, you know what? Let David Jockers take a history and physical examination on that person. Let Jack Wolfson take a history and physical examination on that person. And I'll tell you if they were healthy, because I think, David, and I'm sure you'll agree, that anybody who, for example, has died of COVID, there's always comorbidities that you and I would find. Maybe like you said, yeah, they're not obese. They don't have a history of coronary disease. They don't have a history of lung disease. They don't have a history of hypertension. But again, once you start going down to what you and I would recognize as the real comorbidity, like vitamin D insufficiency, like insulin resistance, like other autoimmune phenomena that we could, get into, or even just assessing markers of inflammation. Like, is somebody, if you're able to look at a group of people and say, well, these people have inflammation and these people don't. Let's see what happens during an average flu season. Well, the people that started off with baseline inflammation, they have to be at much higher risk, complications and subsequent death from any viral, bacterial, any kind of exposure to that. And that even links into, how a truly healthy person can on average deal with something like 5G or EMF toxicity or mold toxicity or pesticides. Again, the more bulletproof the person is, the more the average person, like us, the more we can tolerate these environmental assaults.
Yeah, so true. In fact, I tell people all the time, viral infections actually don't kill people. It's actually your immune system that's not responding appropriately. It's over responding. And so if you have this underlying level of inflammation, it's kind of like having an overgrown fire in your home, and you just pour a little gasoline on it. Now it's going to burn up your house. And so if you're already massively inflamed, if your body's already promoting too much inflammation, then you throw in this virus. Now you are much more susceptible to having what we call the cytokine storm, which is this aggressive activity of your immune system. The immune system is hardwired to protect you from systemic infections. And so it's trying to do the best it can to help protect you and heal you. However, it's uncoordinated, right? And so now it just starts damaging your system, and it damages the lung epithelium. And that actually allows bacteria to seep in. And it's typically the infection from the bacteria, because bacteria's job is to break down decaying matter. Virus actually need a living organism in order to continue to propagate. And so it's the bacteria, though, that will actually kill you. So most of these people are dying actually from secondary co-infections because the immune system is damaging the lung epithelium, making them more susceptible. So we've got to look at like that underlying level of inflammation. So what are some labs and maybe some other things that you look at when you're examining somebody to understand more about their health and their inflammation levels?
Well, I think, like you just said, the checking inflammation, I think, is certainly important. But back real quick to that, the annual statistics that are reported, actually, the CDC doesn't even report influenza separate. It's influenza and pneumonia, just like you said.
Mhm.
The influenza leading to a viral influenza leading to secondary bacterial pneumonia, and in this scenario of of COVID and what we're seeing with cytokine storm with these people that go into ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome, where now their lungs are getting just essentially full of inflammatory cells, full of fluid, and then of course you can't oxygenate no matter what you do, and that's how these people ultimately die, just from extreme hypoxia. And certainly when we talk things, the strategies, the health related strategies, it's all about how to have the proper immune response. Somebody with HIV has no immune response, people with dysfunctional immune systems, and then also could have that hyper response to it. Essentially it's kind of like taking a machine gun, to a to an arm wrestling competition. Once again, you bring in all of this battle equipment into that environment, and there's going to be collateral damage, because yes, you may kill off that virus, but you're also going to kill off everything. If you're trying to, another analogy, I guess, maybe if you're taking the machine gun to kill a house fly, well, you may get the fly, but again, you're going to destroy your house in the same scenario. But certainly when we measure markers of inflammation, and this is why I know you and I are big fans, and I know you talk about it in your book Keto Metabolic Breakthrough, just about test, don't guess. And I think even there's a lot of people in the health space that are going to be listening to us right now, and they're like, well, you know what, I eat the perfect diet, I'm all organic, and maybe you're vegan, maybe you're paleo, maybe you're keto, maybe you're carnivore. I'm guessing most of your audience is slanted towards the latter, as is mine, certainly.
Mhm.
But no matter what you're doing, obviously, doing it organically, okay, and I get the sun and I get the sleep and I take some quality supplements and I'm doing all this stuff, that's great. But you need to get tested just to make sure that everything is working appropriately. It's not 10,000 years ago where, yeah, you could be sure that your behaviors led to the ultimate in health. Now we have to really test, and you're right. Checking. I think the markers of inflammation are really probably the top. The most important thing that I look at right off the bat to determine if someone's healthy or not, are they inflamed? And obviously, if they're inflamed, HSCRP, phospholipase A2, oxidized LDL, MPO, you can check interleukin levels. You and I both know you can go down the whole list of all these different possibilities. Once you find that inflammation, now you have to go deeper and, okay, well, why is that person inflamed? And from there, yeah, you're looking at things like you said, insulin resistance, you're looking at the vitamin D, you're looking for that leaky gut, you're looking for all other autoimmune factors, environmental toxins, pollutants, molds. The list fortunately goes on, because you and I will go down that whole list, keep looking, as opposed to the standard cardiologist who says, okay, you have inflammation, here's your aspirin, here's your Lipitor, good luck. And and then ultimately, David, too, let me just circle back as far as why do marathon runners have a higher incidence of coronary artery calcification? They're marathon runners and they look great and they're super slim and they look like a bunch of David Jockers. The difference is that they are highly inflamed because, sure, they keep the weight down by running marathons, but they run a mile and they have a power bar. They run another mile, they have a Gatorade. Again, they're generating a lot of oxidative stress, but if they're not putting in antioxidants to combat that and equilibrate that, they're going to start having inflammatory coronary artery disease and other health issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're constantly spiking cortisol and stress hormones, which is constantly elevating up their blood sugar. And so they've got this blood sugar roller coaster that they're dealing with as well. Yeah. And to add into that, a big thing I like to look at is your fasting insulin levels. I mean, that's also a really, really important factor. So I've seen a lot of people that look healthy on the outside. We do a fasting insulin. So they haven't eaten in 12 to 14 hours and it's like 11, 12, right? But you would think from the outside, they look healthy. These are people that are developing metabolic disease. And so that's a very simple, easy test that can be done. And, definitely gives you an insight into what's happening in the early stages, because the higher your insulin, the the more insulin turns on inflammatory gene pathways. So that's critical. And then what you also mentioned too, you could be eating a healthy diet, exercising regularly, doing your best to keep stress down, getting your vitamin D. But if you're living in a moldy home and you're breathing in mold all day long, it's chronically inflaming your body. So we've got to really look at all these different factors, and that's where testing can be really helpful. Working with an expert to help guide you in this can be just so helpful. Now, I wanted to circle into the ACE2 receptor. Obviously, being a cardiologist, this is a factor when it comes to things like high blood pressure. What they found is that the SARS-CoV-2 is, this COVID-19 virus now is getting into the cells through the ACE2 receptor. And what's interesting is that research has shown that vitamin D plays a really important role in helping protect against that. And so can you talk more about that? And then people that are taking high blood pressure medications like ACE2 inhibitors, how that impacts this?
Well, once again, the angiotensin converting enzymes, that is essentially how you keep your blood pressure normalized and stabilized. Kidney perfusion as well has to do with this particular enzyme. And again, you go from renin, which is a hormone released from the kidneys that has, again, effects on it's all just about adequate circulation to all of your cells and all of your tissues. So renin, angiotensin 1, angiotensin 2, and then again, how angiotensin 2 affects the body. And this angiotensin 2 can get in through one of the receptors, this ACE1 receptor, ACE2 receptors that are there. And the thought and the concern early on was that people who are on ACE inhibitors would therefore have higher levels of this ACE2 receptor, and they would be at increased risk of complications from SARS. And I think that was certainly a concern early on. From what I've seen, it doesn't really appear to be a factor, and what they're telling people is not to stop the particular pharmaceutical. Now, me personally, as yours is as well, our goal is to always get people off of pharmaceuticals. So that's what we're always trying to do. There's a role for pharmaceuticals in emergency situations, but in this scenario, how do we get people healthy and effectively off off of the pharmaceuticals for blood pressure? And one of the strategies, of course, is sunshine, to crank up levels of to do a lot of different things: increase nitric oxide, improve melatonin production, but then also in this conversation to help with vitamin D and the production of vitamin D. And vitamin D actually is in the beginning of that pathway, where it is a natural renin inhibitor. So again, the kidneys are putting out this hormone renin. High levels of renin will lead to higher levels of angiotensin 2, and then the activation of that to therefore vasoconstrict the blood vessels, when all the person needed was vitamin D, preferably from the sunshine. There is some data that vitamin D supplementation can be helpful. I know you're critical of a lot of these vitamin studies, because again, if you take 100 people that eat, again, McDonald's cookies and cupcakes, half get vitamin D, half don't, you're not really going to get a good response, to really get a real world situation as far as, okay, this guy over here takes vitamin D supplements and follows all the other recommendations by Dr. David Jockers, and this person over here doesn't. Obviously, this person here is going to do infinitely better. But I think ultimately, once again, the best strategy to keep your immune system strong, and the simplest strategy and the most cost-effective strategy, is getting sunshine. And there's so much literature that's come out now about sunshine and about those people with the highest levels of vitamin D, to keep them bulletproofed. And really, I think also, David, is that how vitamin D modulates the receptor, the ACE2 receptor, and how, again, it's not that we don't want to shut down these receptors. That's not what the goal is of the natural doctor. It's about how do we make sure that receptor is getting activated in the response, because I think, once again, that if you have dysfunctional receptors and then that receptor now climbs into the cell and then starts causing damage to the DNA, to the RNA, maybe in that scenario, again, we know that low levels of vitamin D, high incidence of cytokine storm. So again, once again, it's not about how we shut down anything or activate anything. It's about how do we provide the body with the tools it needs to get the job done naturally, and again, to keep us naturally bulletproof.
Yeah, for sure. And vitamin D also helps to modulate our Th1 immune system, which is our intracellular immune system. And that's the part of the system that really goes hyperactive when we have some sort of viral issue. And we need a good, really healthy, strong Th1 system. Vitamin D helps to optimize it. But it's like, in a sense, instead of, if we're trying to, throw an arrow at a board, we're going to go more into the bullseye rather than like throwing it and hitting, the side of the wall or whatever it is. It's going to be more accurate, more effective. And that's really another thing that vitamin D does with those inflammatory pathways. So important. And so what is the difference between like vitamin D supplementation, good research on it showing that it's very helpful taking a good vitamin D3 supplement, but there's definitely differences between getting sun exposure on as much of your body as possible and actually taking the supplement. I know, for example, the sun exposure really plays a big role with impacting your mitochondrial health, right? So actually activating mitochondrial biogenesis. Can you talk more about that?
Well, I think, listen, is that, we all kind of reach towards vitamin D as kind of like the main thing when we talk about sunshine, yet the sun does an infinite, many things in addition to vitamin D creation. Now, vitamin D creation is obviously critical. Vitamin D receptors are in every cell, tissue, et cetera, of the human body. And again, to be able to give your body the right way to make it in enough amounts and the appropriate way to naturally do it, that's where the sunshine exposure comes in. And as far as the differences are concerned, once again, you have to how we make vitamin D comes from cholesterol coursing through the skin. Sun hits it instead of turning it into it's a precursor of cholesterol.
Yeah.
Instead of turning it into cholesterol, it'll turn it into vitamin D. So when people have cholesterol issues, per se, we have to cholesterol, low vitamin D. Well, lower the cholesterol down, and then you'll raise vitamin D when you get that sunshine exposure. But the vitamin D also, to be effective, has to be the sulfated form. And again, that requires you to have proper sulfur in your system. So vitamin D supplementation, certainly as a standalone, is just not enough. Your body still has to take a couple extra steps to make it to the fully formed functional vitamin D. And I think that's where there's some discrepancy between the people who take supplements and as far as maybe some of the the bang for the buck, if you will. But it should never be a standalone. Vitamin D, again, it has to work with all factors that are involved. Certainly people who take vitamin D, they should be taking vitamin K, knowing that vitamin D supplementation also can raise cholesterol levels, because now if your body is not making its own vitamin D, naturally, when you supplement, you can actually raise some of the lipid levels as well. And I know you and I talked about that in our first episode. But, once again, it's just, there's, if there's anything that's really come out about the literature in the last 4 months, it really is about that protective effect of vitamin D, which I think is really just a surrogate marker for sunshine exposure. So when I see somebody, and when you see somebody who's got very low levels of vitamin D, we're not telling, okay, jump on the supplement. We're not saying, okay, pack in all those animal foods that are high in vitamin D, of which, maybe there's a little bit in yeast and mushrooms, but otherwise there's no other vegan source. You have to get it from animal products. And, we're looking at that person. First of all, they look pale. You can tell sunshine.
Yeah.
You can tell they're not getting outdoors. You don't even need the marker. You can say you have a sunshine deficiency. But that's what the vitamin D does. It's, level does. It says, okay, then it needs to hear the sunshine story more. They need to understand that all life is outside in the sun, and it is only the humans that are sitting inside, and we're the ones who are sick.
Yeah, for sure. We got to get that good sun exposure, the biophotons coming from the sun. I mean, we're really like biophotonic beings, right? I know I interviewed Sayer G and his book Regenerate, and we talked about that, how humans can actually help produce energy through consuming food, and also the sun actually impacting, with the combination of chlorophyll in our body will actually help produce energy. Sun exposure helps stimulate mitochondrial biogenesis. So some important things there. And you talked about having sulfur as well. What are some of the best foods to consume? Because sulfur is an amino acid. And so what are some of the best foods to get your sulfur levels?
Well, typically when you think about sulfur, you think about a sulfur smell and you think about eggs. So
Yeah.
eggs would certainly be high in the sulfur-containing amino acids, methionine, cysteine, and of course, those are all building blocks for glutathione. And glutathione levels, when they're at their highest, lead to the best health outcomes because of all the different things glutathione does. For anyone who's listening, just to read about glutathione, how beneficial it is. Another place where there's massive amounts of glutathione, of course, is in the lung tissue, the cells that line the lungs, the epithelium. And if you have high levels of glutathione, which may be a reason why some people want to nebulize
Mm.
glutathione, is that direct nebulization of glutathione is proven to increase levels of the lung tissue as well. So, again, I mean, you're breathing this stuff in, it's going to increase the
Yeah.
levels and do so beneficially. But listen, people, those other, onions, garlic are very high in sulfur. The animal, organs, liver is very high in
Mm.
sulfur as well. The brassica vegetables, broccoli, sprouts, Brussels sprouts, so on and so forth. Those are all fantastic sources. I love eating seafood. I love eating whole seafood. There's just so many benefits from doing that, and that's a great way to, again, to get the sulfur into your body. Then you have all these other coenzymes and all these other minerals. This is another place where magnesium, of course, is very important to the sulfation, not only of vitamin D, but also on the inside of the blood vessels. And whenever people talk about glucosamine, it's glucosamine, sulfate, MSM, another, popular joint product, is a sulfur product. And I think that so many people suffer from sulfur deficiency. This has been written a lot by Stephanie Seneff, Anthony Semcel. They talk about it as well. And, essentially, once again, it's just a building block for glutathione, and having lots of glutathione is certainly, very beneficial. And, I think also, you and Sarah, I'm sure, touched on a lot as far as, the mitochondria, and that pretty much all disease can trace to the health of the mitochondria. And and what that does, as far as obviously, when the sun comes in and it kicks off a molecule of nitric oxide, and the fourth enzyme in that cytochrome P450 in each cell. And as it kicks off nitric oxide, well, nitric oxide is a vasodilator,
Mm.
anti-inflammatory,
Yeah.
anticoagulant. So all these people that are suffering from cardiovascular effects from COVID, and the literature now, again, I mean, there's so many people who do recover from COVID or that died of COVID. It's not from pulmonary issues. Oftentimes it was from cardiovascular. And that, again, if we crank up levels of nitric oxide through sunshine, through foods such as beets, leafy greens, arugula, etc., they're high in nitrates, which get converted into nitric oxide. And the third pathway is the amino acids. L-arginine, L-citrulline, L-taurine also help to increase levels of nitric oxide. And then ultimately towards, chiropractic. It's like, well, how does chiropractic come in to the whole situation here? Well, again, chiropractic by improving and balancing that autonomic tone, by influencing healthy function of the liver, of the blood vessels, of the immune system, all stuff that is proven in chiropractic. And I personally, believe that as I increase nitric oxide levels by salivary testing in my patients, that chiropractic is part of that whole approach. So I do believe that chiropractic, again, will improve nitric oxide levels.
Absolutely. Well, chiropractic definitely plays a big role with balancing your nervous system, your sympathetic fight or flight, and your parasympathetic rest, digest, and heal. And you really need good balance there. A lot of people are either in sympathetic dominance or they can be in parasympathetic dominance. And so creating that balance is key, and chiropractic is foundational to that. Now, we've been talking a lot about mitochondria, And can you explain a little bit more about what mitochondria are, the importance they have to our body, and then also your best strategies, best lifestyle strategies for improving mitochondrial function?
Well, mitochondria are these, tiny little fuel factories inside of the cells. And originally, it sounds like, and from what I understand it, that essentially there was a bacteria that was what, and this, we're talking about billions, a billion years ago, and how some of these bacteria again got engulfed by other cells, and those bacteria, along with their DNA, would eventually be called mitochondria in humans and primates and other animals. And again, we have always been taught that the mitochondria are, again, the fuel factories of the cells that make ATP, which is the energy currency. But as you start to read other people like Gerald Pollack and the fourth phase of water, you realize that the water inside of our cells is not coming from what we drink. We think, okay, we're going to drink this water down and now it's going to flood our water. And in fact, actually, all that cellular water and the way that is all structured actually comes from the mitochondria. The mitochondria is taking oxygen and combining it with hydrogen from food, and now it's forming water with a waste product of CO2. So again, having that well-functioning, well-oiled, well-lubricated mitochondria is absolutely key. And there's so many cases in the literature and so much that's in there that talks about mitochondrial dysfunction and how it leads certainly to cardiovascular disease. I could talk about that all day long. But again, how it just leads to, just every disease. It starts in the mitochondria. So again, good mitochondrial health, it's all about just all the strategies you and I talk about. It's the sleep, appropriate, sleep, it's the sunshine, it's giving the body quality foods, it's avoiding all the chemicals and pollutants and toxins in the environment. Talk about EMF, all day long. Sayer and his team are obviously, phenomenal when it comes to EMF. Essentially we're all electricity. So when you create this man-made electrical and electromagnetic fields from all that surrounds us, how does that not impact the human body? Well, of course it does. And the heart, when you do an EKG, you're measuring the electricity of the heart. EMG, electricity of the muscles. EEG, electricity of the brain. So to think that someone walking around with a cell phone on their shirt pocket is not going to impact their heart. It's absolutely asinine. So again, those are all strategies when it comes to, how, the mitochondria, how this all works. Again, it's the energy from the sun and the energy from the food and the breakdown of all of this in a positive way, but then how it's negatively impacted if you throw in heavy metals, you throw in plastics, parabens, phthalates, pesticides, you throw in EMF. It's just going to the with the machinery and essentially, and this is the beautiful thing of what we do, is that doctors like you and I have all these answers, but we're not getting interviewed on CNN, we're not getting interviewed on Fox. Yeah. They're not talking about any of these things because again, it doesn't sell their agenda.
Yeah, you're totally right. And my favorite strategy costs nothing at all for improving mitochondrial health: intermittent fasting. So when you fast, you stress the cell, you stress the mitochondria, and the body will actually break down the dysfunctional mitochondria. We have an innate intelligence within us. That innate intelligence isn't going to break down healthy mitochondria. It will break down the ones that are damaged and dysfunctional, break those down, and then take the raw materials and form new, healthy, young, vibrantly alive mitochondria. It's a process called mitophagy, right? This autophagy process where the body literally recycles itself. And so if you just skip a meal a day, right? Eat 2 meals instead of 3, tighten up your eating window perhaps, or even go a day. Like it's always a goal with my clients, if I can get them metabolically flexible enough to go 24 hours without a meal. If you can do that on a weekly basis, and then, you can eat obviously healthy and have a feast day and things like that, throughout the week. But if you can go 24 hours without a meal and hydrate well and be able to do all your daily activities, that is a sign your body has good metabolic health. And that's a sign that your body is turning over these bad mitochondria and forming new, healthier mitochondria. So I challenge you guys, listeners, to start to work in that direction. You might not do it immediately. You might gradually lean into it and move into it. But over time, if you start practicing intermittent fasting, it gets easier and easier and easier. So let's talk a little bit about hydroxychloroquine, the most censored drug in the history of mankind, and what your experience with it is, and what's happening with it.
Well, I mean, listen, first, let me just say my default is always anti-pharmaceutical. So, again, the whole idea of even a lot of people in the holistic space touting the use of hydroxychloroquine, I'm totally against, because it is a pharmaceutical. It does have serious cardiotoxicity. It does so in a variety of ways, but the most common of which, of course, is lengthening a part of the EQT. And the longer that QT interval is, the higher the risk of someone developing a lethal heart rhythm called torsades de pointes, or a form of ventricular tachycardia. And why would anybody? I would never want to take that under the guise of prevention. Like, my prevention is all the stuff that we've been discussing. Now, I guess if I was in the hospital and we were throwing things to try and stick into a person who, again, was suffering from severe cytokine storm, they were in some kind of septic shock, well, there's probably little downside to using that, because, again, they're in such dire straits. Now, personally, what I would like to do, David, I would take that person who's in the intensive care unit on a ventilator, and how do we wheel this person outside to bake in the sun? That's would be my number one strategy. But again, I mean, I think that there are a lot of doctors that are claiming success with hydroxychloroquine. The studies, at least that I've read, that are coming from the mainstream journals, Agenda, are they trying to sell us something different? The answer is yes and yes. But again, the literature really that's been published in mainstream peer-reviewed journals really doesn't support the use of it. Certainly in mild case of steroids, of intravenous steroids, we've known that viruses from novel to this. We've used that in the intensive care settings for many years with efficacy. But again, hydroxychloroquine, I'm sure you do as well. You get these emails, coming in, or phone calls to the office. Can I get a prescription for that? I'll never prescribe it. I'll never prescribe it to someone, again, to think they're going to take this on a preventive basis. It's just not something I do with prevention. My prevention is, okay, listen, how do we, again, let's talk about food. Let's talk about sunshine. You want, prevention supplements. Let's talk about vitamin C. Let's talk about zinc. Let's talk about, getting in, a little bit of argent and silver. Let's use these natural boosting strategies, as far as the way that I'm concerned. But I do think, once again, it is well known and well documented that hydroxychloroquine carries cardiovascular risk. And it would be a shame to think, okay, I'm going to take something for prevention and then put myself at risk for dying from a lethal heart rhythm issue. If you were to take it, you need a baseline EKG first. And I would probably do an EKG after day 5 to see if you start to, lengthen out that QT interval. But I certainly wouldn't prescribe it without that information in hand.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think my biggest issue with it is the censorship that's taken place. Because I really feel like people should have the option to be able to take it. There's millions of people that are taking hydroxychloroquine all around the world for malaria prevention, and taking it in low dosages, from what I understand, has been shown to be fairly safe. Now, again, I'm not pro pharmaceutical. I personally don't take it. I wouldn't take it. There's other things that act. So hydroxychloroquine, the idea of it is that it acts as this zinc ionophore, where it helps funnel zinc into the cells. And zinc is very antiviral. And so it helps zinc become more effective. Now, there are other things like quercetin, for example, which is something you can find in elderberry, for example, a real rich source of quercetin, red onions, particularly the outer layer of the onion.
Capers.
Real rich. Yeah, capers, another great source of quercetin. And you can take supplements. Like one of my favorite supplements that I take is resveratrol and quercetin. It's a combination of resveratrol and quercetin. I do it. I have a history, my family history, and a personal history of skin cancer. And resveratrol and quercetin are very protective to epithelial linings like the skin. They also support mitochondrial health. They can also act as zinc ionophores. And so those are things that naturally you could be doing, vitamin D, all the things that we talked about. However, I feel like people should have the option to take a low dose hydroxychloroquine. And, it's one of those things where, like the Zelenko protocol, where this Dr. Zelenko in New York, he was treating all these people, with hydroxychloroquine, zinc, and then, these were the high risk people with comorbidities. Yep, and azithromycin, and seeing phenomenal results, right? Phenomenal recovery. And I think that should be an option for people, and doctors should be trained and educated on how to use it, just because we have like our society is so medicalized. I wish everybody would just say, oh yeah, I'm going to take the quercetin. I'm going to, go out and get the sun, get my vitamin D. But unfortunately, we have such a medical model society. I think people should be trained. Doctors should be trained on how to use it appropriately, right? For example, there's several studies, New England Journal of Medicine and the Lancet, they had studies retracted because of false data. There was also toxicity. There was also a study that was published showing that hydroxychloroquine was dangerous, but the dosages they were using was upwards of like 2,000 to 2,500 milligrams a day, which is known to be highly toxic, cardiotoxic. And so the low dosages seem to be safer, from what I understand, safer than like Tylenol, right? Taking Tylenol on a daily basis, which you and I both don't recommend anyways. But
yeah, I mean, for those people, that would be considering that, once again, I think that, it's always nice to get that baseline EKG, check that first, make sure your QT interval is not longer than 440 milliseconds. And then something, of course, that shortens up the QT is magnesium. So you want to make sure you take a lot of magnesium with that. If you're, just to kind of keep an eye on that, use some of those strategies to help improve that, because again, it's not going to, low dose is not going to bother the masses. And like you pointed out, there is a long track record of somewhat safe usage of this. But that being said, it is an artificial stimulant in the body. Obviously, the body doesn't need it. There's so many other factors. But if you're going to do it, again, adequate magnesium, potassium, making sure all that stuff is really cranked up to high levels. And I think, again, if you're truly a healthy person, I think you'll tolerate the hydroxychloroquine better than the person, again, who has other morbidities that we talked about. Now you're dumping a pharmaceutical into the body as well. So just keep an eye on it. And again, it's just, I also, and I know you don't say this, of course, but it's just, looking for the panacea from the medical pharmacy, as opposed to always continuing to put forth, the dialogue of like, hey, you know what? Instead of even talking about this, let's just continue to hammer home, good food sources of zinc, how zinc enters a cell and it comes through, good receptor function, membrane function, and cellular membranes depend on omega-3. So all these vegans that are out there that don't get omega-3, EPA, DHA, now their cells are dysfunctional. Or just the average person, again, who's not eating seafood on a regular basis, how those cells are dysfunctional because, again, we're not giving the tools the cells need to get the job done.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, I heard actually an interview on another podcast where it was a COVID survivor, and this guy had a really, really bad complication with COVID. And his doctor had given him hydroxychloroquine, and he started having tachycardia. And in particular, he couldn't sleep at night. And I immediately thought magnesium deficiency, right? And so, that's such great advice to realize. And most pharmaceuticals that you take actually deplete magnesium and B vitamins and possibly potassium in a lot of cases. So if you are on pharmaceuticals, it's a good idea to also discuss with your doctor taking some extra B vitamins, extra magnesium, things like that. Magnesium is one of the safest supplements that you can be taking. The way you get too much magnesium is you have loose stools. That's the primary symptom that you experience. So I think that's key. And then also upping your zinc, right? I know seafood is one of the best sources of zinc. Again, zinc, really great for viral replication, stops viral replication. Seafood, you should be
Shellfish.
consuming. Yeah, shellfish, oysters, right? Seafood, such a good source of zinc. Now, if you have comorbidities, if you're an older individual with comorbidities, you may have trouble absorbing the zinc because you're probably producing low stomach acid levels. So taking like some apple cider vinegar before your meal can be really helpful. Maybe some extra betaine HCl or some hydrochloric acid can be extremely helpful. And if you take zinc supplements, this is a big mistake I see a lot of people make. They take it, a lot of people take it on an empty stomach. You never want to do that. It can cause nausea. Always take it with meals. I think that's really important. Jack, how about, a friend of my wife's was texted her, messaged her the other day saying that her boyfriend, who's fairly young, 30s, looks fit. Again, we don't exactly know how healthy he is. I don't personally know him. But apparently he had COVID, and now they're saying he was able to get over it and everything, had mild symptoms, but now they're saying that he has cardiovascular like complications because of it. So have you heard anything about this?
But I mean, this is certainly, over the last few weeks, there's been a lot of mainstream media publicity of this. There was a study that was released that was in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, that talked about 100 patients that they looked at that had recovered from COVID, and they saw through MRI testing how they had cardiac dysfunction. So the hearts were a little bit enlarged. The hearts didn't squeeze as well as they should. They used different imaging techniques to see that there was evidence of inflammation of the heart in general. So clearly, how does, if COVID how does COVID again affect the heart? Well, I mean, if someone is hypoxic, low oxygen level, well, the heart is not getting enough oxygen, so that'll certainly be a problem. COVID looks like it actually causes hypercoagulation, or makes, for sticky blood or sludgy blood, for it to happen as well. In that sense, by COVID, depleting levels of nitric oxide, you can also get vasospasm. That's a way, so, and then just direct infection of virus into cardiac tissue, leading to inflammation. So there's a lot of different things, that are happening to these people. But again, I think in general, like you said, you don't know, your wife's friend's husband, and again, how that person looks. But I just, if you look at 100 people, well, those 100 people were probably unhealthy. And again, this isn't unique necessarily to COVID-19. It can happen to influenza from other viruses as well, where some of this long-term cardiovascular damage is done. Now, the question is, okay, now once you recover, how do we improve that cardiac function? Yeah. Well, those are all the different strategies we talked about, starting with the mitochondria. And again, getting those people under the care of doctors like and on, that's how they're going to recover. As opposed to mainstream, they're going to say, well, here's the ACE inhibitor, here's the beta blocker, maybe here's some other kind of anti-inflammatory type products that people would use for cardiovascular patients again. But again, none of it's addressing the cause, and that's why the outcomes for these people are lousy.
Yeah, for sure. And the good news is that your body can heal itself. That your body, just like we talked about that mitophagy, where the body recycles those mitochondria, it can recycle cardiac cells, right? It can help rebuild new, healthier cardiac cells, new, healthy epithelial lining of your blood vessels. So even if you had some sort of, really bad, or you have a family member that had a really bad, COVID infection, and maybe they have some of these complications, not too far gone. Your body can heal. It can repair itself. I mean, if you do the right things in the course of a year, I mean, you can literally turn over just about every single cell and reform those. And so, that's the good news. And obviously, Jack and I, we talked a lot about different strategies in order to do that. So you start taking action with those things now. One of my favorite, again, intermittent fasting, simple, easy thing to practice, and then incorporating good, high quality, high intensity exercise during your fasting window, either right at the end or maybe like towards the end of that window. Doing that high intensity exercise really stresses you metabolically, and your body will adapt and become stronger, more resilient, and will start to break down all those damaged cells and rebuild new ones. And so, Dr. Jack, this has been a fantastic interview. Any last words, like any last strategies that we haven't talked about, or any last words of advice? And I know also you do an AFib webinar, so we'll talk about that too right at the end.
Well, I think that, it's just, we live in this culture of fear. And I think it's important to get out of that culture of fear. We talked about all the other strategies, but again, are any of that more so important than positive mental health or wellness? Believing that you are truly bulletproof, your immune system is bulletproof, not being afraid of a virus, not being afraid of a bacteria. Again, keeping your house as strong as possible, but both mental and physical. And when all we are doing is sitting inside and watching television and watching the fear channels, we're just perpetuating the sickness and the chances of us getting sick. So it's like, find your happy place, get out of the fear channel. It's like every time I log on to, my email, it's like another person died, another celebrity is sick. And it's just, again, the media is not there to inform us. The media is there to keep us addicted to their programming so they can sell us, Tylenol down the road, or the new, injection that's coming towards us. That's what they're trying to sell, is that culture of fear that leads to the culture of profit for them. But we're wise to the system, and we'll unplug, and we'll just keep talking about the truth.
That's right. When you know the truth, you can live without fear, and that's liberating. And so let's talk quickly about AFib before we finish up. This is a really rapidly growing condition. It's scary. And obviously, the medical system really has very little to no answers for it. But now you're providing this great webinar and this program that you have to help people with that. So can you talk more about that?
Yeah, millions and millions of Americans, obviously, and tens of millions worldwide, are affected by atrial fibrillation, and where the top part of the heart just kind of, quivers or shakes or fibrillates in this case. And what it is, it can lead to a lot of symptoms: heart racing, heart palpitations, skips, flip-flops. It can lead to some more severe symptoms: shortness of breath and chest pain, or lightheadedness, or even passing out. It can eventually lead to congestive heart failure. It can increase your chances of dying, but then also it's a risk factor for stroke. And whenever you talk about stroke, that gets everybody's attention very quickly. So the purpose of my webinar on atrial fibrillation, again, is to be able to get people to understand, hey, you may have it, or even if you know you have it, come up with some strategies that are to, I went to the prescription drug, or they signed me up for an ablation and they said it was no problem whatsoever, and they do it all the time. And yeah, the risks are very minimal. Again, what I like to be able to tell people, as do you, what are the causes? And by going after causation, that's how we're going to have the true healing of the body to prevent, treat, reverse atrial fibrillation. That's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, really good stuff. And so glad you're putting together this webinar and program. And so if you're out there, if you are a family member, maybe you have a family history of heart disease, AFib, really common, obviously, with heart disease, it's a heart-related issue. So you or a family member is dealing with this, or you have a family history of heart disease, I'd highly recommend getting on the webinar. So we'll have a link in the show notes. So check that out. Dr. Jack, thanks so much for all your knowledge, your expertise. I think you've provided incredible value for our audience. So thanks again. And for those of you guys that are listening, remember, you're more valuable than you think you are. So go out, start taking action to improve your health today. Be blessed, everybody.